So many of you here, welcome. This is something I'm super excited about. This is Mr. Phil Renaud. If you've not been on our website, I would recommend later on looking up his bio. I mean, he's got a fascinating story, and very honored for Phil to have joined us today from WHOI Institute. He is the project manager from the Twilight Zone. I'm not going to get into details. I'm going to let him cover it, but a lot of you I know haven't even heard of the Twilight Zone, so we're going to learn something very new and fascinating today. And Phil, the floor is all yours.
Well, hello everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. And Cheryl, thank you so much for setting this up at Deep Blue Adventures. And I've been watching a couple of the presentations today and made me really want to be underwater, but this is a good second place to be. So I'm a retired captain in the Navy. I was an oceanographer for 25 years, and I retired in about 2004, and I was the director of the Living Oceans Foundation for 15 years. And now I'm up in Massachusetts at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and I'm the program manager of this fascinating project to study the mid-layer of the ocean, and we call it the Twilight Zone or the Mesopelagic, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. It's full of mysterious creatures and full of life in this mid-layer of the ocean. And the way this project came to be is through this TED program. And so just a couple of years ago, TED started this thing called the Audacious Project. And we competed. That's our lead scientist, Heidi Sosik, on the stage up in Canada doing the presentation. And that led us to win this Audacious Prize. And so we got a big grant at Woods Hole to run a 6-year program to rapidly study the mid-layer of the ocean. And there's such very little known about the mid-layer of the ocean. It's really remarkable how little is known. So we have some goals, and one is to really rapidly improve the scientific knowledge of the Ocean Twilight Zone. So we have about 5 different themes of science. We want to know about the biomass, the biodiversity. We want to know about food webs. We want to know how climate is controlled by this region of the ocean. And also we want to know more about the life histories and behaviors of some of the animals that you see on the screen right now. We also want to influence international ocean policy. And right now, there are a lot of different initiatives worldwide to try to govern the high seas better and to create marine protected areas and policies, treaties to protect the high seas and the mid-ocean. And we want to ignite the public's imagination. We want to empower people to care about this unseen region of the ocean. We know quite a bit about the surface. We know quite a bit about what lives on the bottom of the sea, but we know very little about this mid-layer of the ocean. And we also want to create pathways for other institutions to be able to study the Mesopelagic. It's deep, it's dark, it's difficult to access. It takes a lot of expensive technology right now. And so we want to make those more readily available to the world. And so people wonder, what is this? And this is the mid-layer of the ocean. And it goes from about, 600 feet, 200 meters, all the way down to roughly 3,000 feet. It's kind of loosely defined. And the interesting thing about this is that around 600 feet, there's really not enough sunlight to produce photosynthesis. And so everything in the surface layer is powered by photosynthesis, and the whole food web is created by the sun. But in the twilight zone, it's a whole different ecosystem, and it's not powered by the sun. There's still light here at 600 feet, but once you get down to 3,000 feet, almost all visible light is gone. And that's why they call the next layer the midnight zone. And I just thought it was interesting to point out that we've put 12 people on the moon, and we've only put 8 people onto the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean. And what's really interesting is that in 1960, Jacques Picard and Don Walsh went down in this vessel called the Trieste. And nobody broke that record until 2012. And that's when James Cameron went down in this one-man vehicle here. And then last year, this guy from Texas, Victor Vescovo, he had a new submarine built called Limiting Factor. And he has really set some new records. There's going to be a lot of documentaries coming out soon. There has been very little news, intentionally, very little news. And then above that is Woods Hole Oceanographic Alvin. This is the Alvin, and that can only go down to about 6,000 meters. So it's just interesting to see that we've put 12 people on the moon and only 8 people on the bottom of the sea. So very little of this mid-layer of the ocean, the twilight zone, has been explored. We figure about 1% of it, if that. And the animals are so mysterious down there. One of our scientists at Woods Hole, Larry Maiden, he discovered this thing called the Squid Worm, and he documented. And so when you just kind of look at it as a big picture, you have the light zone, the euphotic zone, and then the twilight zone. And you have to remember that many top apex predators, they're called charismatic megafauna, the big whales, the sharks, they often go down into the depths and feed on this massive animals in the twilight zone. There's such a massive animals that it creates this thing called the deep sound scattering layer that sonar actually bounces off of. And these animals engage in a daily vertical migration. And that's considered to be the largest animal migration on Earth. And so there's a little video here about the creatures of the Ocean Twilight Zone that I want to share with you. Here's a collage of images that Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution took just over the last couple of years since we started this project. And the way we collect these organisms is really by nets right now. we've just invented a new robot that I'll show you later that we can observe and monitor some of these animals in the water. But right now, the only way to really look at these organisms is by bringing them up in nets. And we put them in an aquarium and then take the photographs like that. So almost all of these images, and they're just, it's such a wild collection of animals, and many, many gelatinous animals. So there's finfish, there's jellies, there's a lot of shrimp and squid. So this is a krill up here, and the krill is really the base of the food chain. In the Southern Ocean, in the Antarctic, the krill are really, really dense, and sometimes you can have 30,000 individual krill in 1 cubic meter of water in the Southern Ocean. And everything feeds on these: the squid, the penguins, the fish, the seals, humpback whales, killer whales. This really forms the base of the food chain. And some of these animals are just absolutely remarkable. And they're all quite small, and they're all quite toothy. And so this one here is called the fangtooth. This one on the bottom right is called the Sloan viperfish. And this one up on the top right, that's the black dragonfish. So they all have these fierce names. This one here in the top is a half-naked hatchetfish. This one here is a strawberry squid. So this strawberry squid, we recently went on a mission and we found a number of these, and all over their entire body are these photophores that they use with bioluminescence, and it's part of their whole life history and behavior. So fascinating, fascinating collection of animals. And just our most recent mission, we conducted in March, right before the COVID outbreak, on our own Woods Hole ship called the Armstrong. And we found this gulper or pelican eel. And wow, that thing really is an amazing animal. It gets to be about 2.5 feet long. So it's one of the bigger animals in the Twilight Zone. And its mouth acts like a net. And that gulper eel will eat krill and other shrimp and crustaceans. And in the previous slide on the top left was the lancet fish. They eat these pelican eels. These things, their jaw can open up really large to kind of scoop in their food. And then this is called a bristlemouth. These are considered to be the most abundant vertebrate on Earth. And when you think of an abundant vertebrate, you might think of something like a chicken. So it's said that there are approximately 3 or 4 chickens per human being on Earth. And these bristlemouths, they think there are about 10,000 bristlemouths for every human on Earth. So there's a ton of them in the Twilight Zone. And that's about the size of a bristlemouth. It's about as big as a quarter. So very, very small. So the interesting thing is, you're not going to find Twilight Zone fish on a dinner plate anytime soon, but they are considered a very valuable source for producing fish meal. And some countries have been experimenting with commercial industries to scoop up all of this life out of the Twilight Zone and use it for our own needs. Now, I'm going to start this little movie. This is one of our scientists and photographer extraordinaire, Paul Cager, and he's going to explain how he takes some of these photographs.
My name is Paul Cager. I work for Woodhull Oceanographic Institution, and I am a fish ecologist. I'm here on board the Aleutian as part of this Twilight Zone cruise to take some photographs of the creatures we're collecting in our net tows. So we're out in the Twilight Zone trying to study one of the least known regions of the planet. Not much is known about the Twilight Zone, so we're using multiple techniques to try and figure out as much as we can about what's going on in this vast area. We focus on trying to capture these animals in as good a light as possible and trying to make these small, very small and delicate animals come to life. Each day we'll do several net deployments, and as soon as those nets come back in, bring them back into the lab and quickly pick out what we want to photograph. I have a shipboard photography setup based in the aquarium lab, and I will be putting animals and fishes and invertebrates on trays in water and using macro lighting and macro lenses and getting some really close-up nice imagery of these animals. This is a bristlemouth, be the most abundant vertebrate on this planet. In the Twilight Zone, bioluminescence is a really important characteristic. For instance, some fishes use it to attract prey. Some anglerfishes and viperfishes have little bioluminescent lures they'll dangle in front of themselves to attract prey. Some fishes in the Twilight Zone use bioluminescence to hide themselves from predators. These light-emitting organs underneath their belly, when looked from below, can hide their silhouette from the downwelling light. I'm a fish ecologist, and I'm really interested in fish diversity, the taxonomy, how the fishes interact with the rest of the ecosystems. On the other hand, I'm also interested in sharing as much as we can with the wider public, getting the world involved and engaged in what's out there in the Twilight Zone. And by taking great images of this, we can share this and spread that story, which is a really important story.
And now I have a little film clip to show you how we start to analyze these fish. And we have about 12 senior scientists on this project. And then we have a lot of students and postdocs and probably 25 various young scientists working on this project. And this is Helena McMonagle. And she did a lot of the dissections. She's now out in Washington State trying to get her PhD. So here's a little video that Helena made.
My name is Helena McMonagle, and I'm a technician at Woodhull Oceanographic. We just deployed the mock nest, which is a multiple opening and closing plankton net. So it has multiple nets that sample distinct layers of the ocean. So we sampled 8 different layers of the ocean, starting from 1,000 meters at the base of the Twilight Zone up to the very surface. What we do is we bring in those zooplankton into the lab, we split them in this Folsom splitter, it's called here, the circular splitter, and it randomly divides the sample into 4 parts. Those 4 parts go to 4 different labs, essentially. So this tells us where these animals lie in the food chain, what the diversity is, and who's eating who.
So we've been looking at a lot of tiny animals, but it's amazing how interconnected the ocean is. And these large animals that live in the surface zone that we're so familiar with, like this great white shark, they spend a lot of time in these depths. And so one of our scientists, Simon Thorold, is working on the food webs and how interconnected the surface level of the ocean is with this deep twilight zone. And so here's an article that he recently published about how blue sharks use these anticyclonic eddies in the Gulf Stream, these warm core eddies, and they find these warm core eddies and they dive down and then enter into the twilight zone to feed, and then they come back up in this warm core eddy, and that's so that it preserves their body temperatures. These sharks get cold. It's interesting that the swordfish is really highly adapted. and it can regulate its body temperature better. And so it can spend a lot more time in the twilight zone feeding than, say, a blue shark or a great white shark. And so I've got we put tags on these sharks, and some of these tags are quite sophisticated, where we can get readings from the tags from these animals while they're at depth. And we have to put out these sound sources on buoys in the ocean to do that. And we've tagged swordfish. This is a Mako shark you see here on the screen. And the Mako sharks are really amazing animals. And so if you watch over here, you'll see the shark dive. And so this is about 3,000 feet, 3,300 feet, something like that. And watch this incredible profile that this Mako shark can do. And so it dives down to, 1,400 meters or so, and then it comes up, and then it feeds in one of those layers of organisms in the twilight zone. And then it gets cold, has to come up to the warm surface waters and warm its body back up, and then it dives again. So this is over a 40-hour period. You can see this shark in 40 hours took these long, deep dives in order to feed in the twilight zone. So this is brand new, hot off the press science and some new knowledge that we've been learning. I guess you would ask at this stage, why are we doing all this? What motivates us to do this? And I really think it boils down to two overarching reasons. When you think about how man has exploited so much of this earth for our own needs, and we typically blunder when we do that. We make mistakes. And so here in the year 2020 is this basically unexploited, huge area of the world. I mean, think about it. It's a 1/2 mile belt of the ocean that wraps around 2/3 of the earth. It's absolutely massive. And so with this Audacious Project, we're wondering, can scientific understanding outpace the exploitation of this? And that's why we're plugging in to international policy matters so much. And then we also know that this region of the earth is a big buffer to climate change. It sequesters a massive amount of carbon and holds it there with all of these organisms. And so if we can refine the estimates of how much carbon gets sequestered in the twilight zone, we'll be able to really help climate models, and that's a major undertaking. So I think these two are really the main drivers of our project. And the incentive to harvest the deep sea is really strong. I'm sure many of you have heard about these manganese nodules that companies want to mine from the bottom of the ocean. Well, there's similar commercial interests in harvesting the deep sea to make fish meal for both agriculture and aquaculture. And then like omega-3 nutritional supplements. And there's some natural toxicity and also some toxicity from human pollution. And so there's some PCBs and mercury found in these deep sea animals. So when I say it's one of the last non-exploited ecosystems on the earth, it's still not pristine, of course, because of all of the chemicals and pollutants that we put into the ocean. And there's also some interest in getting materials for lubricating oil, waxes, and some seasonings. So that's what's driving some of the commercial interest. And the way they're planning to do it is by using like a factory ship, and this net would be deep in the ocean, and it basically would suck up these small organisms, and then it would be fed through a vacuum system right back onto the ship. So they wouldn't have to retrieve this net that's a half a mile under the ocean. And so that's the way they're intending to do the industrial fishing. So we're trying to stay ahead of that. We want to be able to inform policymakers on how fast these fish grow, how they reproduce, and how they're connected to the fish that we fish from the surface. And this gets a little bit deep into the policy making, but this page is talking about ecosystem services that we receive from a particular ecosystem on Earth. And all of these ecosystem services are broken down into 4 categories. It's called regulating, cultural, supporting services, and provisioning. So provisioning would be food or fish meal. So the Twilight Zone contains this vast amount of biomass. I mean, when you think of it in terms of how much fish is in the surface layer, there's something like 2 billion tons of fish in the surface layer. We think there could be 10 billion tons of fish in the Twilight Zone. And supporting services is what I was talking about with like swordfish and tuna and sharks and whales and seals. They all rely on the Twilight Zone for their food source. So if we over-harvest and suck up all the food source out of the Twilight Zone, we're going to damage the surface fisheries too. Cultural services are an interesting one because typically it's coastal communities who have relied on the ocean for their culture. It's a little different in the Twilight Zone, but this webinar we're doing right now is advancing the cultural services of the Twilight Zone. And then the regulating is all about carbon sequestration and climate change. And we believe that this regulating ecosystem service is valued at about between $260 and $660 billion a year to our civilization. Because if all of that carbon was simultaneously released in the atmosphere, greenhouse warming would be horrendous. And so how did we ever discover that there are animals in the Twilight Zone? It's really from sonar in World War II. So this is in the daytime when the organisms are deep, and that's actually a sonar return. And then at night, a lot of those organisms move up to feed. They feed off of the phytoplankton that's at the surface. And then once again at night, back down they go. And so this is what's called the diel vertical migration, the daily vertical migration. And we made a little simulation of that, showing how this massive biomass just undulates day by day by day, unseen to us, and how it connects the atmosphere to the deep ocean, how it takes carbon out of the atmosphere and brings it down into the deep ocean. It's really an amazing thing to think that's happening every day. So I wanted to just show you some of the gear we use. Woods Hole Oceanographic, a lot of what we do is design and engineering. We specialize in giving scientists access to the sea. So if a scientist says, hey, I need you to build me something I can tow a half mile under the ocean and pack it with sonars and cameras. This is our vehicle called Deep Sea. And as you can see here, it is absolutely stuffed with scientific instrumentation. we've got holographic cameras and imaging systems and stereo cameras and all kinds of sonars on here so that we can measure and understand the animals in their own environment. And this is a little bit complicated, but it's showing you the scattering layers in the twilight zone, and it shows you the profile that we towed that piece of machinery, the deep sea, and then it's indicating that a sonar on a ship, which is the typical case, because of the distance that sonar has to penetrate, you really can't measure animals very well with a shipboard sonar. But when you put this deep sea right down into a scattering layer, you're measuring things on a much finer scale. And so, for instance, these are individual fish or organisms that we're measuring off that system. So it's a remarkable advancement in our ability to understand what's happening in those depths. And then that's a multi-beam sonar that's mounted on the front of that sled, and you can see individual fish and targets in there. So when you start talking about the ability to make better estimates of biodiversity and biomass, this is the type of gear we use. And then if you really think about it, understanding how our Earth is going to respond to these greenhouse gases is really the scientific question of our era. I wonder in today's climate, understanding the future of viruses is probably right up there with this one. It's about how we're going to live sustainably with this Earth as we go forward in time. And so we're looking at this thing we call the biological carbon pump. And it's super complicated. There's very little known about it. This is the Diel vertical migration. Diel is another word for daily. Of course, scientists have to have a scientific word for everything. And so the phytoplankton on the surface, and then the zooplankton, which are like animal larvae. And then this shows fecal pellets. And so as the animals defecate, those fecal pellets sink into the deep ocean, and they take carbon and sequester it way deep in the ocean, and maybe it'll stay there for 1,000 years or so. So we're very interested in that whole mechanism. So this is a submersible I went on last March, and I was a half a mile under the ocean in this submarine. And this is what you see. You see all this particulate matter, and then, okay, there's a jellyfish, helmet jellyfish, and all of that particulate matter is called marine snow. And there's a famous ecologist actually from this area, Rachel Carson, and she described it as the most stupendous snowfall on Earth, this marine snow. And we're building these slick little sensors called minions, and we're envisioning that we would deploy these by the dozens, and they go to a particular preset depth, and then they have kind of an iPhone camera in them, and we can measure how much marine snow is falling through the ocean. And here's a simulation of the marine snow falling on the lens, and then a couple of animals that are eating that marine snow, because it's really just carbon. And then there's this blocky yellow thing here. That's actually a fecal pellet from what's called a salp, a gelatinous organism. And so these salps can be as numerous as the krill that I talked about, just millions of these salps. And they form these quite dense pellets, and they sink rapidly through the ocean. And so we think that the salps in the twilight zone are responsible for sequestering a lot of carbon to the depths of the sea. Another thing we've designed, just probably the latest tool in our inventory, is the Mesobot, the Mesopelagic Robot. And this is a intelligent, stealthy robot to track animals. And we've been building it since last summer. You can see the frame being built in our laboratory. And we basically have it operational now. And we can use that Mesobot to do what's called adaptive sampling. So we'll put that robot down into one of these thick layers of organisms, and then we'll grab a water sample, and that's called adaptive sampling. So we can use our sonars to understand where the layers are, and then we can deploy the robot to those layers, and then we can image and follow organisms and then take different samples. And we're using a lot of DNA strategies. When we get a sample specimen, we'll actually take a piece of its flesh and we'll barcode the DNA. We also dissect the gut contents of the fish, and then we blend those up in a blender and send that sample off to the lab, and that gives us kind of a community of DNA. And then we can just take a water sample and put it through a filter, and that's called eDNA, and that's kind of a forensic analysis of what's been through the water. We don't actually take a sample of the fish or the organism itself. And so here's kind of a result of that sophisticated environmental DNA analyses, and you end up with a graph of the frequency of the animal and the depth. And so we get this big picture of what lives, what the biodiversity of the Twilight Zone is, just by collecting water samples. And so recently, we partnered with 4 oceans. They're the ones that do the plastic cleanup. And we created this movie together with them about jellies in the Twilight Zone.
Jellyfish, or things very similar to jellyfish, have been here in our oceans for more than 600 million years. They're part of the history of evolution of life on Earth. A lot of them live in this Twilight Zone area that's down to about 3,000 feet deep. And we don't know very much about anything that lives there, let alone the jellyfish. Sometimes we call that inner space. It's like things that would live in outer space because it's so big, except it's on our planet, it's all water, and it's just totally different from what we're used to on land. You know, jellyfish had been studied for 100 years, but it was just jellyfish that came close to shore and they were easy to catch and that people knew about. And now that we know that so many of these jellyfish are out in the open ocean and the deep ocean, we need ways to get there.
Well, the Mesobot is a new kind of robot specifically for exploring the Twilight Zone. Its job is to emulate many of the qualities of a skilled scientific diver. Being able to hang almost motionless in midwater and observe the animals, to take samples, to take measurements, and to do that in a very unobtrusive way.
We've been working on an environmental DNA sampler that goes onto Mesobot. eDNA refers to pieces of DNA that's in the environment that were shed by the different animals that live in the environment. So it's pretty exciting in that we're actually, with this eDNA approach, we're not even sequencing the animals, we're sequencing their forensic fingerprints or their traces of DNA that have been left behind.
When we say we're worried about the future of the ocean, it's not that the ocean is going to go away. It's that We're worried that the ocean, which has been a beneficial part of human life and human evolution, is going to change in ways that won't be so beneficial anymore. People have found plastics almost everywhere in the ocean, including the deepest parts of the ocean, like in the trenches. So we know that the plastic comes in at the surface or at the edges of the ocean, and we know that it's showing up at the bottom. So it has to be in the middle in some parts of the twilight zone and in the deeper part of the ocean. A lot of different kinds of animals we're seeing plastic in their stomachs now, and fish and marine mammals and turtles and so forth. And so a lot of these are things that feed on jellyfish also, and so easy to mistake the jellyfish and the plastic. So I think that that's the real concern right now, is the larger things which just look to a predator like something that they're used to eating, but they're not.
Understanding the Twilight Zone will be a key part of managing the oceans in the future. We believe most of the fish in the ocean live in that region. If we're going to protect it, we first have to understand it.
Even for our coastal jellyfish species, we don't have a good handle on who they are. And so that makes me think, if we don't have this knowledge in these, quote, easy places, what does that say about somewhere like the Mesopelagic Zone, where we've explored such a tiny fraction of it? What's waiting there for us to discover?
I always like to find new things, new species, and the Twilight Zone is a great place for that. That's one of the coolest things, is you go there and you find something that's probably been living there for millions of years, and you're the first person to see it. Doesn't get much better.
So that's the program we're doing, and we're really trying to change minds and behaviors so that we can protect this Earth we live on. This is really a moonshot, and the teamwork and the number of scientists working this project is really remarkable. And we're on a quest to extend man's reach into this vast unknown by using some cool technologies, and then bringing people like you together with us on this exploration. We've got a tremendous engagement program. So this program is equal parts science, technology, and engagement, and that involves the policy and just sharing with the world these amazing creatures that live on our planet. And so that's it. I'll open it up to questions, Cheryl.
Okie dokie. Thank you, Captain Phil. We do have a couple of questions already. And first of all, I have to say, wow, I'm not a smoker and I need a cigarette. I don't know about anybody else. So I'm going to try and find where people, I'm going to unplug their mics so they can ask you directly. But we do have a couple of questions already, so I'll get you started. Kathy, tell her, Kathy, I'm going to find your microphone. But in the meantime, she wants to know, do the fish survive being brought up from the depths to survive to surface temperature and pressure? Sorry, let me read that again. Do the fish survive being brought up from the depths to surface temperature and pressure?
Yes, they do survive, and they're adapted. You know, these fish have these swim bladders, and they're highly adapted to be able to take those differences in pressure. But I'm not sure if you asked, when we pull them up with the nets, no, they typically don't survive long once we get them into the aquarium on the ship. So that's why we designed that cool robot, so that we can observe these animals in their natural environment, you know, without disturbing them. But when they conduct that daily vertical migration, they're perfectly adapted to do that. And then you also find a lot of the body life forms in the Twilight Zone are gelatinous, and a lot of that is due because they're just suspended in the ocean, and the gelatinous organisms are able to take that pressure difference very easily.
Thank you. Kathy, you are unmuted. If you wanted to say anything else, you've got to unmute your microphone. But Kathy, did you want to add anything to that? We're showing your microphones off. I tell you, we'll go to Jeremy and then Kathy, let us know in the chat box if you're able to get your speaker, your microphone going. Jeremy Starr, your microphone's unmuted if you have a question for Captain Philip.
Yes, Captain Philip. In your graphic with the Mako diving down so deep initially and then coming back up to feed at a much higher level, are they diving down? What's the purpose of them diving down so deep? Are they eating a different food source lower and then coming up to a higher level and eating there?
That's a really good question, and it's not known right now. So I asked the lead scientist on that particular part of the project, and his original thought was that they're trying to conserve energy, and so they want to overshoot those layers and then start to work up slowly until they find the lower layer, and then they move up shallower to the next layer and then finally to the surface. So that's really a good question, and the scientific answer is unknown right now on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Shelley, you're unmuted. Do you have a question for Captain Philip?
From either where they live or going to Woods Hole and getting more involved in projects such as this.
Shelley, can you start your question from the beginning because we didn't hear the very first part of your sentence?
Sorry. I was mostly wondering if there's any way to get involved on a personal level with projects such as these.
So we're really doing an awful lot right now to kind of engage the public as we go on this exploration. And we've been talking a lot about trying to start up what we call a citizen science program. They do this a lot. NASA likes to do this, where you basically set up a program where the public can help analyze, data. You can imagine with these systems we're putting down into that deep part of the ocean, we're collecting, thousands and thousands of images, and it's just so labor intensive. If you can't automate it, you can kind of parse that out to the public, and each person takes one image or 5 images and tags those images and then sends it back to us. And so those are some of the things we're trying to do right now to engage the public a little bit more. So I guess that's about as best of an answer as I can give right now on how you can get involved. But
Yeah.
You can also go to the Woods Hole Oceanographic website and sign up. And if you like this type of information, Woods Hole is doing so many fascinating things that you can get on kind of a newsletter and follow all the latest developments on projects there.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Brent, give me just a second. All right, Brent, your microphone's on.
Captain, thank you very much for taking your time to put this together. Question, when you're in the manned vehicles at depth, how frequently, if ever, do you see any of the large predator type animals that we normally think about feeding down there?
Very infrequently. And one of the things I've been talking about lately, there's a guy who runs a small company around Woods Hole that does a lot of like deep sea photography and imaging work. We need to do like a special mission where we want to attract animals in And I've been talking about using like baited cameras. And so, of course, you know, when fishermen use chum to, or if you want to dive with the great white sharks in a cage, they have to attract those big predators in. And so in order to see something like that in the mid-ocean, you either have to be super lucky or go somewhere like Cocos Islands or Galapagos where those sharks are aggregating. But if you're just like plunked down into the middle of the ocean somewhere, you would just have to be incredibly lucky to see one of those animals go by. And so I'd like to do a special mission more for kind of public engagement where we use more baits in order to attract the animals into the cameras. And there's another researcher, her name is Edie Witter, and she's like America's most well-known bioluminescent scientist. And she recently developed an artificial lure based on like colored LED lights. And she was able to attract in one of those Humboldt squids. And so we were thinking we could put like LED light lure on that Mesopod to try to attract in some bigger predators. That would really be fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same thing that they're doing with the blackwater dives that we do now.
Yes.
Photographers near the surface in the evenings.
Yes, and we did a blackwater dive in the Gulf of Mexico this past year, and the photographers got some incredible images. You know, so I was talking about that daily migration, right? So these mesopelagic animals come up quite shallow. I was just reading an article in like the what is it? The Alert Diver magazine from Dan, and
yes.
They were talking about being in Indonesia and doing night diving and encountering a lot of these Twilight Zone animals, and they were describing them, and it was remarkable to me. So if you're lucky enough to be a recreational diver and do some night diving, like some black diving like that, it can be pretty magical.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
I have a couple of questions from people whose microphones aren't working, so I'll read them. One question from Andrew is there any research being done on the rates of bycatch that would occur should fisheries use the large nets/vacuums to collect fish from the Twilight Zone? And if so, what species do you think would be caught as part of the bycatch?
So I've read that there's considerable bycatch of lancet fish in the tuna industry. So when they're fishing for tuna, oftentimes they drag up a lot of these Twilight Zone lancet fish. For these big nets that they would actually harvest the Twilight Zone organisms, if they were targeting one species, like the lanternfish seem to be one of the most desired fish to be used for fish meal, there would be a massive amount of bycatch because these organisms, they form these layers together and they follow the light levels as night approaches and they go to the surface, and that's where they'd be catching them. They'd be fishing mostly at night and closer to the surface just because it's difficult to put the nets down so deep. And this is the problem with fishing the Twilight Zone. I think bycatch is one of the biggest problems because they're just going to scoop everything up out of the Twilight Zone. It would be extremely hard to target a particular fish in the Twilight Zone. So that's one of our major concerns. This topic that you hit on is one of our major concerns and commercial interests opening up, major fisheries in the Twilight Zone. So that's a really, really good point.
Thank you. We'll have a couple more questions. I know we're running over. I'm happy to sit here all day, but I don't want to keep you here all day. You've given us an hour of your time, and we truly appreciate it. Who do I have? I have Vernon Chin. Vernon, you are able to speak. You need to undo your mic, but you should be able to speak right now. Actually, it's not. Carrie, if you can give me a hand and work on Vernon real quick and see if it's letting you unmute. I think this is another one of those versions that they're using where it's not allowing the unmute. But if Carrie, you can help me with Vernon. In the meantime, I'll move on to Matthew, who also doesn't have a mic. Matthew is asking, is the research published, and if so, where?
Yes, so this research project is a 6-year project, and we're just approaching the end of year 2. And so we've really just started to collect data and start to work up and analyze it. We've got a few papers published already. The earliest one was that blue shark tunneling down in the warm core eddies. And we've got probably 8 different manuscripts that the various scientists are working up right now. And I just got an email this afternoon from our carbon scientist. He's got an article that's coming out in a couple of weeks in this major periodical called PNAS. So we're going to put all of these manuscripts and all of these published articles on the Woods Hole Twilight Zone website. So that's going to be a central point. And that new there's a website now that you can go to, the Twilight Zone Woods Hole website. You can go there now, and we're going to be unveiling a brand new website in less than 60 days from now. So please stay tuned to that.
Great, thank you. And in the meantime, everybody, where you registered for this webinar on our website is a direct link to the Twilight Zone page on the current Woods Hole area. Stephanie Richardson, I'll do Stephanie, and then Vernon, real quick, your microphone is not unmuting. So Vernon, I know you had your hand up. If you want to type that in real quick, I will get that over to Captain Philip. In the meantime, Stephanie, you're on.
Hi there. Just a quick question. I know this is very new research. Would you say that you can identify maybe an indicator species for this layer, or no? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I'd say the 2 indicator species are the lanternfish and those bristlemouth fish that I showed you. So those 2 would be significant indicator species for this. And I think it's the lanternfish that the commercial interests are really focusing on because of the omega-3 content and the ability to convert those lanternfish into fish meal. And they're fascinating. They have photophores on their belly. And so what they do is they match the light coming, the downwelling light coming from the sun. They match the intensity of that downwelling light with the photophores on their belly, so that when like a swordfish is looking up, they'll be invisible. They'll be camouflaged by the light. So the lanternfish are really cool.
That's amazing. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Vernon, I am so sorry, but I didn't get a message from you and we couldn't get your mic undone, so I'm sorry for that. So that's all the questions that we have. Captain Philip, I really appreciate your time. This has been so amazing. I've been so excited about this. And I'm sure you haven't been looking at the comment section while you're presenting, but I wanted you to know that it was blowing up with just people that are wow and fantastic and amazing. And a lot of people here really didn't know much about the Twilight Zone till now, and you've sparked an interest for a lot of them. Everybody is saying just how impressive and awesome and fantastic and incredible are the words that are pouring in right now on the chat. So thank you so much for this.
Hey, it was absolutely my pleasure, Cheryl, on this, in these funny times. I'm glad I could have opened some eyes about how cool that Twilight Zone is.
Well, you certainly did. And I know for me, I didn't think once about anything else going on outside this world. I was rooted to my armchair, and happily so.
Well, thank you for setting it up. You guys are great.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we'll be definitely following your work.
All right. Thanks a lot, you guys.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.